say Green Day with American Idiot, I had conversations with Ted again on that. Like, what was your sauce on that? Like, what were you using for that record? And he gave me a little bit of a heads up on what the processing was, and I was using that same technique, on the mixes coming from CLA. Because if you move things like the vocal, I found like some people will just put the object like maybe in the middle of the room or like too far off the wall to where on speakers it feels like it's just this obscure vocal thing. You can't really like pinpoint the localization of it, but on headphones it sounds drier, and it sounds up front. Anything that I'm using in Atmos is what I'm going to be using typically in stereo mastering minus the final limiter. If you're mixing through a limiter on your stereo, you might want to consider reducing that or removing it in full.
What are the best practices for sending you a mix in Atmos? Hey, Adam, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Jose, thanks for having me, man. Thanks.
Let's start with basics. Why is it necessary to master in Atmos?
Well, it's kind of the same reason why you would master in stereo or vinyl or any other format. It's just kind of, in my opinion, it's just kind of elongating that story that we've had over time where, it's that we act as a third party to what the production has been up to this point. And so we listen to the mixes, we're just trying to, essentially respond to that in any kind of creative way with EQ adjustments, as like a kind of small way that we can impact mastering onto an Atmos production. And then also in the broader scope of what it can be for a full album and making sure album dynamics are being recognized too. I think that there's a lot of, because there's such strict guidelines for Atmos with minus 18 LUFS, minus 1 dB true peak, that that things just tend to be minus 18 for the entire album. And maybe musically that doesn't make sense. You might want a ballad to actually set back in the dynamic for the context of a record, have a loud song feel that way. So we're also looking at stuff in a broader spectrum for that, creatively, making sure that, you're feeling those peaks and valleys that you can have for a record. Then there's the technical considerations for it. Just given how many different ways Atmos can be played back, headphones to multi-speaker environments to even it's different depending on Amazon versus Apple Music. So each of those is almost a mastering process in and of itself. There's stereo mastering is still a part of Atmos in some ways because you listen to the stereo down mix, but then you have these added layers of multi-speaker binaural headphone renders as well. So technically, there's a lot of considerations there to make sure it translates and it's within spec for all the down mixes. And then creatively, we're trying to make sure we're doing traditionally what we have done in mastering, which is try to make an album feel cohesive, especially if there's multiple producers on a project, it gets tricky. Yeah.
What are the main differences between mastering for Atmos and mastering for stereo?
Yeah. So, well, with stereo, I guess to kind of generalize stereo right now, stereo for like digital, essentially, like you can have the LUFS be whatever you want, essentially. Obviously, sonically, you might not want to go super loud just because of the production. The true peak level, it can get up to minus 0.1. I've seen stuff go out that has 0 dB true peak, and maybe that's not correct, but I know that the DSPs for like Spotify and Tidal and everything else want like a minus 14 LUFS, minus 1 dB true peak. Generally for stereo mastering, I just think things tend to be louder than that just by design. So for stereo, you can kind of do whatever. For Atmos, there's quite a lot of considerations for it, given the fact that it can be played on a cell phone in stereo, which Apple kind of does by default now, or it could be in 714 or 5.1. So the main considerations tend to be with the loudness requirements that Atmos requires, minus 18, LUFS and minus 1 dB true peak. And then the addition of an LFE in Atmos also is quite a different thing from stereo in general too. So The workflow, I guess, which would make it completely different, is the fact that not only am I listening to it on speakers, but for Atmos, I have to listen to it many different ways before I feel like it's ready, and ready to go out the door as well. So it's a little bit more time intensive, I'd say.
Hmm. And do you find
Yeah.
it more challenging to master for Atmos? I guess since having more space also mean more room for potential mistakes.
Somewhat, yeah. It kind of it with anything, it kind of varies on the production that you get. Sometimes I pull up an Atmos mix and the fold downs to stereo from the Atmos sound like the stereo mix that we worked from, for the stereo production. So in those instances, it's a very similar treatment between the two EQ wise. But the one thing that can make it tricky in Atmos is if an Atmos production feels narrow, if it's front loaded in the room between left and right, I can't use like a widener plugin, to kind of just like move that out some. Or, if I wanted to move the objects, there's other issues that could create. So you kind of like your hands are tied a little bit with what you can do in there. There's just because it's object based metadata, there's not like this globalized like tonal shaping thing that you can do. You just have multi-mono objects everywhere in the room that probably just need to stay where the mixer put them. So yeah, in some ways it's better because you can kind of, if it's matching the stereo, you have like a little bit of an easier workflow at times, but your hands are tied to some degree depending on how they approach the Atmos mix in general too.
Hmm.
I'm not remixing what they did. I'm just kind of building upon what was already there in the first place.
And can you describe your step-by-step process, like from prepping a session to delivering it to the client?
Sure. How much time do we? Yeah. Yeah. No.
Please.
Sure. I kind of look at it in three different phases essentially because the bare minimum work I'd say in mastering for Atmos is making sure stuff is within spec so it can get through the label's
Hmm.
QC requirements and make sure things get out on time. That's kind of like probably the core thing that at least needs to be done. Um, so I'll take the mixes and I don't calculate the LUFs of whatever they came in yet. I just kind of pull them into the render. I use the external Dolby Atmos render in Pro Tools or with Pro Tools. I'm not using the Pro Tools internal
Yeah.
one. So I load the ADM into there, copy over the input, configuration, the binaural metadata, and I'll look at the trim data, see where that's at. Obviously, direct render is kind of universally used for music releases, and I'll create the Pro Tools session by importing the ADM into that. In my Pro Tools session, it will load in essentially the mix as it came. I have a multi-channel, could be like 80 different channels of objects, and then you have the 712 bed as well. So then I have the Atmos kind of in one lane. I'll throw in the stereo master on another track so I can A/B it, and then I also I have a channel that I use that is the 2.0 direct render essentially of the Atmos mix
Hmm.
that I use to time align. It's kind of an easier way of looking at the waveform to make sure that the Atmos production is lined up to the stereo. So I use that down mix just as like, okay, great. Like I don't have to guess where the first snare hit is. If it's on object 53 or something, I just have it at the top. So it's kind of how I organize it. Um, I have the Grace M908 monitor controller, and I take the stereo production and I route that to a different input on the Grace. And then I have the Atmos coming to another input. And then I have a third lane that I use a 714 re-render of maybe a track that I've already mastered on that album or, the single if I just want to reference it. So what that does for me is on my Grace controller, I'll have the stereo master turned down to match the Atmos mix I'm working on, mastering, and then a reference track right there. So I can just kind of hit the button and then hear all three of those right there. After I do the EQ or whatever mastering treatments there, I export that out as an ADM, and then I'll calculate the LUFs of each track on the album from there. And I'll note essentially from there if we're already within spec or if we're above and the whole thing needs to come down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll do that final export process from the Dolby Atmos album assembler, where I'll import, all tracks in the timeline, make sure the sync is right with the stereo, make sure that the leveling, it's kind of like that final stop of just like double checking everything. I do a similar thing in stereo as well. There's a mastering session and then there's like an edit session where you're doing like the final compiling of the record. So that's emulating a similar workflow from there. And then I'll export it from there. And that will be my final ADM that I'll then send out. So the album assembler is the final stop for a majority of my projects because of that.
Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, in stereo, it's common to send the mix without maybe a limiter or a certain volume. And what are the best practices for sending you a mix in Atmos?
Really, I just need the ADM from whatever the mixer has done. I think that Atmos mastering and Atmos productions are kind of akin to vinyl mastering as well in terms of overall dynamics that you can get from a project. So I tend to lean on the philosophy that Atmos is meant to be a little more dynamic. It's a little more convincing that way too. So if you're mixing through a limiter on your stereo, you might want to consider reducing that or removing it in full, whatever the non-limited mix is that, creating your Atmos mix from something like that. Mm-hmm. In terms of sending a project to mastering for Atmos, really, I'm just making sure that the ADM is, I just need that file essentially. And the stereo master to make sure I can get it within spec. As far as binaural metadata, that's one thing that it's kind of, there's a lot of philosophies on, or opinions, I guess, as to what it should be. Mm-hmm. The labels don't want to see it all set to mid. They want to see like that attention has been made to that. Now, of course, Apple does not use any of that metadata. It is like the premier format for Atmos currently. So basically I need to make sure everything is not set to off, because then it's just a stereo mix. And if it is, then I'll have a conversation with the mixer, be like, hey, like this will get kicked back. We're turning in a dry Atmos mix, which is stereo. So, I kind of lean on things being near. I think personally, everything should probably be set the same across the board. Mid all the way across doesn't sound bad. Near all the way across sounds pretty good too. But it kind of depends on how they mixed it. Mm-hmm. Whether or not you want to adjust that positioning to like far for the heights, because it can create a really interesting thing in moments of music that the Apple render can't. But at the end of the day, the binaural metadata just has to be set to something that is not just the default, mm-hmm. For ingestion to most major labels. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think, does that kind of answer, the way to deliver something in that sense? Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. So cool. So you have the song, it's ready to master. What do you focus on the first time you listen to the song to correct or enhance it?
Yeah, so most of the stuff that I'm doing the Atmos mastering on, we have done the stereo mastering on as well. Mm-hmm. Whether it's myself or Ted or Randy, at Sterling, that's done the stereo side of it as well. So I'm listening for continuity between the two. My goal typically is to make sure that the fold downs for Atmos to stereo will sound very close to the stereo master. Mm-hmm. With maybe a little more dynamic. So I'm listening for just presentation. A lot of this stuff is dynamic processing that I try to focus on in the Atmos, since it is such a dynamic format and things can get moved out almost too much sometimes. It's tricky to kind of make sure things feel glued back together. And it depends on the placement in the room, the mix engineer's approach. So really, I'll just listen to the mix the first time down, A/B the stereo, and just kind of get stuff roughly leveled to where it needs to be. and then try to make a decision whether or not I'm going to EQ first or do some kind of compression to it to kind of, tuck some things in. And then also I take a look at how they approached it. Some mixes are just all bed, couple objects. Some mixes are 70 objects, independent channels, bass drums over there, and vocals are somewhere else. And like, I kind of just try to figure out the lay of the land, because if I just want to DS the vocal, for instance, to like get a couple of things down, then the glory of Atmos is I can just find those two channels or whatever, that one channel, and just target that. So I can have a little bit of a cleaner EQ because I could just target that one range. Same thing with low end stuff like bass. If I'm trying to fix the kick drum a little bit to make it lock in the low end, depending on the mix engineer's approach, I might have that. And so I might consider doing, a fraction of a dB's gain move to that as opposed to an EQ move, depending on what I'm hearing. So it's the first listen is kind of like what did they do? How much room do I have to do something? And, making sure, I'm not going to undo their mix as well, because you can kind of get a little too carried away too when you have individual multi-mono tracks everywhere. I'm not, that's not the goal really, is to remix or change positions. So yeah.
And do you usually start like right away? You press play and start doing stuff or things, or you listen to the whole song and take notes?
So for instance, like I do a lot of work with Ted. I'll actually recall his stereo mastering session and look at what he did there, and see, okay, what's his EQ? What was he kind of going for? And so when I pull up the Atmos session, I'll just start doing a version of his EQ on the Atmos, because, if there was a deficiency in the low end at a certain frequency, there's a good chance, because it's the same kick drum, used in both productions, that it might need that as well. So I'm using that as a launching point, for a lot of it. And so like the other engineers I work with at Sterling, or if I've done the stereo, my first thing is to just start putting as much of whatever was on the stereo to the Atmos to try to color it in a similar way. Because, it's the kind of typical workflow from mixers right now is to just do the stereo first, take those stems, create the Atmos from those stems. So there's so much similarity to the two that, I'm trying to make sure, okay, great. Like if we've already worked through this a bit, they've already approved the stereo master, maybe they like that top end boost. I'm going to make sure we're emulating that for the Atmos, because, I have those notes from before. So it's a little bit of a recall on the first listen. And then, then kind of adjusting from there, because, since it is more dynamic, the gaining of these EQs can change a bit too. You might need to be a little more drastic with stuff, or you might not need it at all. So, yeah.
And how much analog process are you using?
Analog? For Atmos?
None?
None. Yeah. No, I haven't. If I'm doing the Atmos like stem mixing, which we do offer for some clients that don't do Atmos themselves, and I did an analog treatment to the stereo, like I've taken songs where I've run each individual stem through the analog chain to just capture as much of that as I can, and then I'll do the Atmos from that. It's very time consuming, and it's a very, tedious process, and it adds a lot of time to it. But, my analog chain has a sound, and sometimes that's the only way I can get it. But for Atmos, I'm not doing any mastering through analog at this moment. Maybe, there would be a reason to do it down the line, but at the moment, it's all in the box just for ease of flow and not having to do too many steps to it. Yeah.
And what are your favorite plugins for Atmos now?
Sure. I think the Fab Filter stuff is kind of a good one. As far as the EQ, I use that Q3 all the time. I think it's a great tool for it. I use a lot of the UAD compressors as well. I tend to use those like the SSL or API 2500 because they have that sidechain input. Sometimes I want to use that as a function. Sometimes I don't. I'll typically A/B with or without doing that if I'm using a compressor. And those tend to be the most used. I use the that Make Believe Audio's Soundtech
Yeah.
EQ. I think that's a great sounding one. So if I'm doing like an analog adjacent, I have the real Soundtech, so like if I know, okay, that's the frequency, that I liked, like I'll probably use that to do the same thing because it just has a very particular sound. It doesn't sound like a digital EQ necessarily. I'm trying to think what else. The Spherix compressor is one that kind of works for beds as well. It kind of has like a built-in sidechain feature already, so you can kind of everything groups together. Can create a nice glue to it as well. Basically, anything that I'm using in Atmos is what I'm going to be using typically in stereo mastering, minus the final limiter. Not doing a lot of limiting in Atmos as well, unless it's trying to do the true peak thing for, there might be like a snare hit in the last chorus that gets us above. So, maybe I'll limit it, maybe I'll do something to that. But, I think the one thing with Atmos that I appreciate a little bit is I don't have to shop for limiters as much as I do in stereo to figure out what's the right one for like, shaping stuff or being transparent. The transparency just comes from not using a limiter in the first place.
Cool.
So you can kind of impart, I can kind of just do more coloring through the EQ or subtle compression moves as opposed to, having a super colorful limiter necessarily or a
Yeah.
transparent one. Yeah.
Will you use any clippers?
Not really. Not typically. It's not something that I tend to use much at all. It just depends on the mix, but like, I'm not one to kind of do that. If I'm trying to adjust like, any kind of drum transients that way, that might be an instance where I would grab a limiter and like try to duck it that way. But typically, no. If I am using one, the newfangled, I think it's the Elevate has like a clipper function in there, so that one's kind of, if I have one, then I'm going to maybe use that, but it's not a big part of my toolkit in there. Yeah.
And do you think having more space to work with can lead people to lose focus and forget to enhance the song's message?
That's interesting. Yeah. I feel like that there's there is room for that to happen in Atmos, but there's also room for it to enhance it more than stereo. So I think like our lanes for which that can happen have just widened. And I feel like that can happen sometimes if things are sent too far back in the room, or if things are like you lose some of the impact of like maybe a rock song. If you've like moved things like away from each other, then you lose the impact of a rock band necessarily. So like, you can't just like fly the guitars into the back, up real high because you think it's cool, but it's like, man, that guitar in the chorus was actually interacting with the vocal in a way that is like, now it just feels a little disjointed. So yeah, there's definitely a higher risk, I'd say, in Atmos for that to happen, because there's more rooms to move stuff. So, you can really move things away from what they're interacting with, I'd say. So yeah, that's definitely a possibility. The other thing that can get a little awkward is if you move things like the vocal. I found like some people will just put the object like maybe in the middle of the room or like too far off the wall to where on speakers it feels like it's just this obscure vocal thing. You can't really like pinpoint the localization of it, but on headphones it sounds drier, and it sounds up front. So like, okay, it's maybe doing something for the Apple market if they're listening on Apple Music, but if you listen in a car or something, you might be like, man, the vocal just sounds like a little odd, and it's just different from traditionally how we have listened to music on two speakers with a phantom image. So that I feel like can kind of move a production sometimes too far from the original intent, because then you're listening to like this, you're focused on how different it feels, from stereo to some degree, as opposed to focusing on like, is the song okay, Yeah, so yeah, definitely. There's kind of a fine line as far as how far you can go on that.
And can you fix something like that during mastering?
Like the placement of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or
Like the vocal thing?
sometimes the vocal thing is tricky. It depends, it depends on my relationship with a person, or if I'm communicating with them, if, and how it's working. If, I had a record where the vocal, or I had a record where there was probably 3 or 4 different Atmos mixers on it. And the vocal was either phantom in left, right, dry in the center, coming out of all channels, or like really high up above. And each individual song, because they mixed the Atmos around that vocal positioning, was really cool and interesting. And I knew if I told them all just like phantom at left, right, then the impact of what they did with everything else would just be lost.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, well, this is just what it is, So I'm going to kind of make each individual song feel good, and kind of work it based off of that. So I don't really think that there's a right or wrong to these things. I think it's just a matter of if you're doing the right things to support those decisions. Sometimes there are, I'm working on an album with a guy, and he has things like bass guitar that kind of have some height elements to it. And when we got to the Apple render, he's like, yeah, just like things are just hitting weird, and like the Apple Spatial is just not doing it for me. And I was like, and I talked to him, I was like, you have some good things going on, but maybe bring that stuff down, and have it on the floor, because then you'll get a little bit more mid-range detail from elements like that, like the bass, for instance, if they're kind of just coming out of the front of the room, because it's easier to localize, I guess. It's harder to localize bass, but it sounds cleaner when it's kind of coming straight ahead. And so I'll kind of make suggestions like that along the way if they can adjust their mix. Um, I have been in positions where if there's a object that seems a little bit off, I'll move it, and then I'll shoot them a message to let them know, hey, I think that this might be better here. Typically, it's like if there's a guitar that might be like this in the room, like kind of off centered, I might be like, let's just make them hit in the same spot. Because sometimes it's an accident on their end, they exported it and it was locked to a different channel or something. So you can fix some of it in there. If I am going to go in and move a position of something, I'm always going to let them know, because I don't want, I think that it's important to keep that communication open, because maybe they feel strongly about it, and I might send a couple of versions for them to kind of A/B from there too. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And besides that, what are the most common issues you have to usually fix?
The most common issues,
Mm-hmm.
I'd say a lot of it is getting things within label spec. Making sure things are within sync with the stereo, making sure the loudness is fine, that they use the direct render for trim and down mix, and more specifically too, that the trim and down mix settings, when they do fold down, actually sound good. A lot of people just use the default -3 on the surrounds and heights.
Mm-hmm.
And that is okay, but I don't know if it's necessarily like great for music all the time. Imagine a rock production where we have wide left, right guitars in stereo that are way out here. In Atmos, to kind of fulfill that role, you'd put them in the left and right surround speakers. When you do the fold down, if you turn that down 3 dB, you're going to lose that impact of the guitars. So I'll go in and I'll adjust the trim and down mix, A/B it against the stereo, and make sure that the width in the stereo production is also matched in the Atmos. If they did a completely different Atmos mix and the balances around the room are just off, then, I probably won't adjust that. But typically it's getting stuff within spec is one of the harder things. Next to that, it's probably making sure things aren't, maybe this is a bad thing to say, but almost too dynamic sometimes. There's a point where things just feel, like a little disjointed, and like maybe like that snare, whenever it hits, is just always stepping over the vocal in a way that is just like unsettling.
Mm-hmm.
So it's finding that fine line of like, okay, right here, everything feels like it's working together. And that's tricky to do at Atmos because it's multi-mono format. So that's where it gets like really really difficult, as say, to work in it. Yeah, because you have about 100 channels of compression sometimes, and you're trying to figure out how you're adjusting that appropriately depending on how they mixed it or what you're trying to target. Maybe you just compress the two channels that you need to do. So that takes some experimentation sometimes. Like, what's the actual correct way to do this without messing up something else? Yeah.
Hmm. You mentioned you used the references, like the other master version or like the stereo version. Do you
Yeah.
use it in any other way, or just to A/B it?
So yeah, just to A/B, really just between the two. I also use the Audio Movers binaural render app
Mhm.
as well, and I'll use that sometimes to A/B. I use the external version of that because it allows me to send the dry stereo master to that, and then also it allows me to send the Apple spatial render to my headphones, so I can A/B it the way a consumer would on their platform. And sometimes I'll check stuff on it just to make sure like there's no jarring difference. Um, that things are kind of hitting around the same mark, but really the stereo is just to A/B for me. I'm not using it for it's not being introduced into the Atmos at all. It's kind of just still a separate thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And how much do you focus on ensuring the master translates well in binaural?
For both binaural formats, I mean, a lot. Um, at the end of the day, that's the way most people are going to hear it.
Hmm.
And I think that the Apple spatial render is my preferred way, to listen to it. It sounds closer to what I hear in this room, which is actually impressive, even on their AirPods. It sounds pretty good. I think that they've done updates over the years to kind of correct some of the tone that is there. So I know like whatever I'm hearing in the room in the Apple render tend to fall in line. Sometimes if there's a lot of height in that kind of stuff in there, then the Apple render it might do some volume and tonal changes that sound different from my room or different in general. So if I'm feeling like that there's a lot of height in the Atmos production,
Hmm.
I'll definitely listen on the headphones to make sure it's working right, in that same way. So I'm constantly A/Bing either on these or I have the Maxes that I keep next to me, and then I'll put those on. I'll check that out, and then I have a pair of Sennheisers that I'll check the Dolby headphone render as well. And that one's tricky for different reasons because if you're dealing with a whole album, for instance, and they turned the front room to off, LCR to off, and then half the other tracks on the rest of the album was done by a different mixer, and they have that to set to mid.
Hmm.
Then if you're listening on Amazon, you're going to get this room that's like dry or wet or just constantly like moving the listener position, that plane, and like so that's where it gets tricky. Then it's like, okay, well, which one is going to work better moving closer to the other, and where is that middle ground? Sometimes it's just a matter of setting, the LCR to the same for both productions. But if that's ruining one in some way and make the other one fine, then there's kind of a compromise that has to be made. So I'd say that's where it gets the most difficult in the headphone renders is trying to make sure that the album is going to play uh, from the same relative listening position for the Dolby headphone render. So
Hmm.
that one's tricky. That one takes a lot of time to kind of reconcile sometimes because I don't recognize it until I'm halfway through the project and I'm looking at it and I'm like, I have dry vocal on track 8, I have wet vocal on everything else, and what am I doing? Like how do we make this live together now? Um, and so that's kind of an instance where you might have to adjust the binaural metadata. So whoever's listening on Amazon won't be like, what just happened, which is not what we want. We just want them to listen and hopefully be
Uh-huh.
happy with it. So, yeah.
Hmm. And what's the process for client feedback, considering very few people have uh, doesn't have an Atmos system at home?
Right. So at Sterling, we've teamed up with Samply for our uploads.
Hmm.
So when we send to clients, they'll get a download link, and then they'll get another link that allows them to stream it on Samply. And Samply can accept the MP4, and it will stream the Apple Spatial Render to anyone using a Safari browser on an iOS device or the Samply app.
Mm-hmm.
So for every project for Atmos, I'll send 2 uploads. I'll send them that, which is the Apple Spatial streaming link, so that, if they're on the road, which musicians typically are, and they just want to hit play, they can just send that, text it to the rest of the bandmates. And I think that's the easiest way for people to hear stuff, to be honest. And then there's no guessing as to what is it going to sound like on Apple, because it is that, level wise might be a little different, but it is essentially that same room tone and presentation. So that's what I encourage clients to listen to. And then I'll also send them a separate upload that has the ADM and the binaural render as well. And I'll let them know, like, that binaural render, you can listen on any pair of headphones, but that is more what you're going to hear on Amazon or Tidal, so it just depends on which side they fall on. But I think the Samply integration with the Apple Spatial Render is a great tool for getting people to listen to it, because everyone feels like maybe they have to step into a room like this to hear the Atmos. And it's like, while that can be very informative to the decision-making process, and I encourage everyone to kind of hear this on speakers, because it makes a little bit more sense sometimes when you hear it here. A compromise to that is the Samply's implementation of the Apple Spatial playback, which is definitely a good way to go. So, yeah.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
You've mastered classic albums from Billy Joel, Alice in Chains, and Green Day. Do you do anything differently when working with albums that are widely known?
Yeah, tread lightly. Everyone's heard them. And everyone knows what they sound like, and I think making sure that experience is familiar to the end user is exactly what's to be expected. So, I don't think my workflow is necessarily too different from what I do on albums that are just coming, because I'm referencing the stereo at all times. But there is some variance in what the playbook is for that stuff too. So, for Billy Joel, for instance, like Brad Lee, who worked alongside Phil Ramone on those records, mixed all of them, and the mixes I got were really solid, and so it's really a game of, small EQ adjustments and making sure translatability works. I pulled up Ted's EQ notes from that era, and I was like having conversations with him, like, what were you using around then? And I knew that, and I was like, okay, like, but then the mixes I got, like, Brad was not referencing the mix that Ted was sent back then. He was referencing Ted's master. So he really got things very close on that. And similar with, I'd say Green Day with American Idiot, I had conversations with Ted again on that. Like, what was your sauce on that? Like, what were you using for that record? And he gave me a little bit of a heads up on what the processing was, and I was using that same technique, on the mixes coming from CLA, because I talked to CLA before that, and he had the exact recall notes, the fader moves and all that stuff, and he did an exact, really good, recall on that entire record for the Atmos. So, I was just trying to make sure I'm following what's to be expected with that. If there was something in there that was helping the aggression of like the upper mid range or something like that on that record, I wanted to use the same thing, because I'm not trying to, like, I don't want to depart from it. And no one wants to hear a different version of that record necessarily. They want to feel like that this is the same thing, but like a cooler way to hear it, or a different way to hear it, I should say. So a lot of it is just trying to make sure it at least does as good as what, Ted and the other guys have done beforehand. On some of like the Rolling Stone stuff that I've recently done, the playbook is a little bit different. There's a little bit more room to kind of work differently from what I think Bob Ludwig did some of the digital remasters on that. So the mixes, some of them we had like completely different tape transfer, different mixes, so the EQ that I was doing was not necessarily following what Bob did. We were like, well, we have room to like add some bottom end, on this stuff. We have an LFE, so like let's try something different. And the producers on that stuff were very much on board with just like, okay, like we're gonna try to remaster this. Don't follow the stereo in full. Like we can kind of depart from that a little bit. Obviously, everyone knows a lot of those songs, so it's just trying to make sure it's a departure to some degree, but not a overhaul. Yeah.
Hmm. Is it common for the client or artist to set the entire album for mastering, or they prefer to send just one song to see how the process goes?
Yeah, I in a perfect world it would be the full album, but the reality is for music in general seems to be, 3 or 4 singles, and then here's the entire thing,
Hmm.
And sometimes I don't even know that there's an album coming later. I'll just get a single next month, get another single next month, get another, then 20 songs or 18 songs later, and then I'm like, oh, this is an album. And what's so tricky about that, if it's stereo, like cool, like I can follow suit, I can make stuff louder, I can move within that, easy, but with Atmos, this -18 LUFS thing really becomes problematic there, because I'll get that first single, the mixer sent me something that's -18 LUFS, -1 dB true peak. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's the level, I'll send it back. And then when I get the full record, I'm like, well, that's not the loudest song on the album. Like the loudest song is supposed to be maybe a dB, 2 dB louder by LUFS standards.
Hmm.
Um, so then I'm in this weird pickle where I'm like, well, I'll send. I'll essentially what I have to do in those instances is level the album the way I know it should be, and I'll tell them, hey, these tracks that already came out, you should replace them with this new version. Otherwise, it's going to play too loud compared
Hmm.
to the songs in between them. I hope they follow, and they
Yeah.
actually do that. And I think labels pay attention, and if it's the same length, it should be something that they can swap. But it's one of those things where, like, creatively, we're a little handcuffed to that because of the requirements for Atmos. So that's where it gets a little tricky. I wish I had the entire thing, because then I could just nail it the first time, and then everything is. But because of the spec requirements, we wind up in this weird, label political situation where it's like you got to swap them, otherwise creatively this is wrong, and
Hmm.
it's tricky. Sometimes I don't know if that message always gets relayed downstream, and I'm like, well, I really hope that the ballot isn't like hitting way harder than
Uh-huh.
this other
Yeah.
song. So yeah, it's important.
Hmm. How long did it take you to learn mastering in Atmos until you felt comfortable? And what was the process like?
That's a great question. It took a while. I think we had about a year of just kind of playing around before we opened the doors to like getting work.
Hmm.
When we were like, okay, and the process is a little bit multi-step, because I'm in this Northwood acoustics room, and we were in this decision period of like, we're going to add more speakers into a room that is acoustically designed to not have these speakers in here. And that and that would require quite a bit of hardware changes, pulling back the fabric, installing overhead. So when we first decided as Sterling to kind of go into Atmos, the plan was to build an Atmos room at my house, and we were kind of just coming out of the pandemic too.
Hmm.
And to start there and to just kind of experiment essentially. And so it's still set up right now. I have these small Genelecs, like the 5-inch 8330As, I believe. And yeah, to just start, I would just pull it up, pull in mixes, try to do stem things as well. But I really set out to try to uh, see how much of the traditional mastering we can impart on the Atmos. So that process took a while. We got some mixes from some clients that we regularly work with who are, I'm grateful that they sent us, hey, here's something I worked on if you guys need to check it out. And so I was taking that and learning the process, hammering it down, because there's so much room for error, I'd say, in Atmos as opposed to stereo. Even just importing the metadata properly from the
Hmm.
ADM, if you do it incorrectly, you can lose objects, you can change object size, you can move stuff in the timeline. And so it's like, we don't ever want to do that. So it was making sure every time I import something and export it, it's actually the same. And so, a lot of null tests and that stuff to make sure it was working. And then I went through the entire Dolby has a like course to get Dolby certified. And so I went through that entire course as well, just to like make sure that there was nothing I was missing, which that was a great process. I think, it was cool to do that over Zoom with multiple people and kind of just make sure we were on the same page. And then once we got through that, I think that was probably like a 6 to 8 month period over in December. I can't remember which year this would have been, either 22 or 23, maybe 2021. I don't know. It kind of all blurs at that stage. But we outfitted the Northwood rooms with, or at least my room with the Atmos speakers. So that involved putting in the speakers in the ceiling. We got ATC to build us a custom center channel, just because we have a very unique. We have glass on the front wall, and we had a couple holes that were there from a TV mount, and we were like, well, we're going to remove the TV, put a center channel. Can we make sure that the holes line up and the tweeters line up across LCR? And so that took a while for it to just come into play. And then when the room was set up, we had to get Dolby to come in and tune it, and then make our decisions on the tone of the room, calibrated it, and then did a couple more trial runs before we were like, all right, we're ready to do this for clients now. So it took about a year of just like kind of refining, talking, about what we were going to do, and then, how we wanted to kind of enter the market in that way. And I think mastering was definitely the way to do it for us. So, yeah.
Is there anything you've learned from mastering in Atmos that you're now applying to stereo?
Yeah. Yeah. I think my stereo, I've been mastering in stereo for like, I don't know, 13 years now. And like, I've done it and seen it done many different ways. And I was kind of coming off a philosophy like that my final limiter is going to be like coloring and like doing all this stuff and kind of like finalizing stuff. But I've leaned more into this world of like EQ is really what I'm going to lean on to like adjust things in a way. So for my own personal journey in it, I've become better at just EQing in general, which I think has helped my stereo work because I can't use a limiter to kind of dig me out of a situation. And my limiting in stereo has become more of like a transparency tool as opposed to a coloring tool typically. So yeah, that's helped me some. I think I've had EQ, I've kind of had to up my game in that sense because of it, because there's just such more dynamics to work with. So it's helped a little bit, I'd say, in my stereo production as well, just because I'm not so concerned about loudness, and I think that I've brought that to stereo as well, to some degree. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what's the most important thing you've learned that you wish you had known when you were starting with the Atmos mastering?
The most important thing that I wish I knew? That's a tricky one. I think I wish I knew exactly what the end game was for consumers a little bit more, in terms of how I've always just wondered, like, how are they going to hear this on speakers? And so when I started in Atmos with doing any kind of stem production, for instance, it's kind of like my first experimenting in it was just taking stems and moving around the room and listening. And I was like, well, we have heights. So like, I need to do a lot in the heights, and so, you take maybe a very important part, throw it really high in the room, and you're like, cool, that's like, wow, it's coming from everywhere. And then the first time I stepped foot in, a Mercedes that was, a car that was spec'd out to play back Atmos, I was looking at the overhead speakers and it was the size of like a Coke can, and it was just sitting right at eye level. And I was like, man, that's small, and I looked at the center channel and it was like kind of like a small intercom kind of thing. And I was like, the overheads are not really robust in this thing. And I'm like, it's an expensive car. So I played something that had a lot of height element, to it. I played a track that had this like flute that interplayed with the song, and it kind of just talked throughout the room. And when I played it on speakers, I was like, in that car, I was like, it's quiet. It's really quiet. And it's not hitting the same way it needs to be for the song to make sense, because it was kind of like a call and response thing with the vocal, and they were at the same level in my room. But then when I'm listening on a expensive consumer system, I'm like, man, that's not there. Okay, and then also with sound bars, the overhead speakers are usually just shooting up to the ceiling and down. So my philosophy with the overheads has definitely changed over the last few years, from it being like core elements could be up there because you just have the room, to like, I don't think the consumer is really going to hear that yet. There's just not a good case study for that to be replicated. So the heights I've mostly found just verbs, delays, kind of like ambience kind of stuff, ambience that kind of goes up there. And then also, so just no core elements solely up there. If they're going to keep them on the floor and you want some heights, create a send, include it to the height element. And so they live in both places, maybe. But just throwing it up there in its totality is going to be something that's going to ultimately struggle to be replicated on consumer speaker systems right now. I don't know if that's going to change. But it's just a little bit tricky to see someone throwing like a 18-inch driver in their ceiling at their house. It's really tricky to do.
Don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you kind of narrow it down to like, how are they hearing this? It's like headphones and honestly, like if I play Apple Music on my cell phone, it's going to play a Dolby Atmos version out of this, or a laptop. So the fold downs are more important, for these smaller devices as well. So I've put more emphasis on how does it sound on these small devices, as opposed to like, yeah, it sounds great in this large room, but like ultimately this is a very unique listening environment, and this is one small piece of the puzzle in how this will be played back. So it really needs to translate downstream in every way. So yeah, I wish I knew that a little bit more earlier. I'd probably bring stuff down a little bit.
For sure.
So yeah.
Is there anything important about mastering in Atmos that I haven't asked you, but you'd like to add?
I mean, I guess I just think that the fact that it is important, I think, is probably about it. Having just someone kind of finalize something can take a little bit of the workload off the mixer sometimes too, and make releases come out on time as well. I think is important, but I'd say don't necessarily think that it needs to be squashed to sound good. I think that this format is supposed to alleviate some of that congestion that can happen. And so if you're feeling like you need to compress it because you're fitting it all within left, right speakers, like maybe just move it out. It's a huge canvas. Use it,
Adam, thank you so much for being here. I had a great time.
Awesome. Likewise. Thanks for having me on this. I appreciate it.
It was an honor.